Hello there, and good evening everyone. Hope you're well today, and welcome to another live reading of Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, where we're working our way through this wonderful book chapter by chapter and page by page, and today we arrive at chapter 8, which is on religion and temperament, and it's quite different to all of the previous chapters we've read up to this point. I think every chapter's had between 10 and 20, maybe even more quotes. But in this chapter, there's just minimal quotes, and most of the chapter is just Aldous Huxley's words. So obviously he's given religion and temperament a lot of thought, and he feels that he can just express himself without the use of quotes from religious texts and spiritual masters, and who are we to argue? And so, yes, Chapter 8, Religion and Temperament. It seems best at this point to turn back for a moment from ethics to psychology, where a very important problem awaits us, a problem to which the exponents of the perennial philosophy have given a great deal of attention. What precisely is the relation between individual constitution and temperament on the one hand, and the kind and degree of spiritual knowledge on the other? The materials for a comprehensively accurate answer to this question are not available, except perhaps in the form of that incommunicable science based upon intuition and long practice that exists in the minds of experienced spiritual directors. But the answer that can be given, although incomplete, is highly significant. All knowledge, as we have seen, is a function of being. Or to phrase the same idea in scholastic terms, the thing known is the knower according to the mode of the knower. In the introduction, reference was made to the effect upon knowledge of changes of being along what may be called its vertical axis in the direction of sanctity or its opposite. But there is also variation in the horizontal plane. Congenitally, by psychophysical constitution, each one of us is born into a certain position on this horizontal plane. It is a vast territory, still imperfectly explored, a continent stretching all the way from imbecility to genius, from shrinking weakness to aggressive strength, from cruelty to Pickwickian kindliness, from self-revealing sociability to taciturn misanthropy and love of solitude, from an almost frantic lasciviousness to an almost untempted continence. From any point on this huge expanse of possible human nature, an individual can move almost indefinitely up or down towards union with the divine ground of his own and all other beings, or towards the last, the infernal extremes of separateness and selfhood. But where horizontal movement is concerned, there is far less freedom. It is impossible for one kind of physical constitution to transform itself into another kind, and the particular temperament associated with a given physical constitution can be modified only within narrow limits. With the best will in the world and the best social environment, all that anyone can hope to do is to make the best of his congenital psychophysical makeup. To change the fundamental patterns of constitution and temperament is beyond his power. So I think what Huxley's saying there is sort of the nature-nurture argument. He calls it the congenital psychophysical makeup. But ultimately, Gurdjieff would say, Gurdjieff talks about level of being as well, and that certain beings aren't interested in the perennial philosophy or in this or in that, but other beings are, or levels of being. And so it's very interesting to hear Huxley speaking about this stuff. In the course of the last 30 centuries, many attempts have been made to work out a classification system in terms for which human differences could be measured and described. For example, there is the ancient Hindu method of classifying people according to the psycho-physico-social categories of caste. There are the primarily medical classifications associated with the name of Hippocrates or Hippocrates, classifications in terms of two main don't even know how to pronounce that. the thysic or phthisic, and the apoplectic, or the four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and the four qualities, hot, cold, moist and dry. More recently there have been the various physiognomic systems of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the crude and merely psychological dichotomy of introversion and extroversion, the more complete but still inadequate psychophysical classifications proposed by Kretschmer, Stockard, Viola and others, and finally the system more comprehensive, more flexibly adequate to the complex facts that all those which preceded it, worked out by Dr. William Sheldon and his collaborators. In the present section, our concern is with the classifications of human differences in relation to the problems of the spiritual life. Traditional systems will be described and illustrated, and the findings of the perennial philosophy will be compared with the conclusions reached by the most recent scientific research. In the West, the traditional Catholic classification of human beings is based upon the gospel anecdote of Martha and Mary. The way of Martha is the way of salvation through action. The way of Mary is the way through contemplation. Following Aristotle, who, in this as in many other matters, was in accord with the perennial philosophy, Catholic thinkers have regarded contemplation, the highest term of which is the unity of knowledge of the Godhead, as man's final end, and therefore have always held that Mary's was indeed the better way. Significantly enough, it is in essentially similar terms that Dr. Radin classifies and, by implication, evaluates primitive human beings insofar as they are philosophers and religious devotees. For him, there is no doubt that the higher monotheistic forms of primitive religion are created, or should one rather say with Plato, discovered, by people belonging to the first of the two great psychophysical classes of human beings, the men of thought. To those belonging to the other class, the men of action, is due the creation or discovery of the lower, unphilosophical, polytheistic kinds of religion. This simple dichotomy is a classification of human differences that is valid so far as it goes, but like all such dichotomies, whether physical, like Hippocrates' division of humanity into those of phthisic and those of apoplectic habit, or psychological, like Jung's classification in terms of introvert and extrovert, this grouping of the religious into those who think and those who act, those who follow the way of Martha and those who follow the way of Mary, is inadequate to the facts. And of course, no director of souls, no head of a religious organization is ever, in actual practice, content with this all too simple system. Underlying the best Catholic writer on prayer and the best Catholic practice in the matter of recognizing vocations and assigning duties, we sense the existence of an implicit and unformulated classification of human differences more complete and more realistic than the explicit dichotomy of action and contemplation. In Hindu thought, the outlines of this completer and more adequate classification are clearly indicated. The ways of leading to the delivering union with God are not two but three: the way of works, the way of knowledge, and the way of devotion. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna instructs Arjuna in all three paths: liberation through action without attachment, liberation through knowledge of the self and the absolute ground of all being with which it is identical, and liberation through intense devotion to the personal God or the divine incarnation. And so, if you followed along with the Bhagavad Gita as it is playlist, we're up to, I think, chapter 15 now. You'll be well aware of what Krishna says to Arjuna about liberation. I think these quotes are from, they look like they're from the Bhagavad Gita, so there are a few quotes. Do without attachment the work you have to do, for a man who does this work without attachment attains the supreme goal verily. By action alone men like Janaka attained perfection. But there is also the way of Mary, freed from passion, fear and anger, absorbed in me, taking refuge in me and purified by the fires of knowledge. Many have become one with my being. And again, those who have completely controlled their senses and are of even mind under all conditions, and thus contemplate the imperishable, the ineffable, the unmanifest, the omnipresent, the incomprehensible, the eternal, they, devoted to the welfare of all beings, attain me alone and none else. Hi Laura, nice to see you, I hope you're well. But the path of contemplation is not easy. The task of those whose minds are set on the unmanifest is the more difficult, for to those who are in the body the realization of the unmanifest is hard. But those who consecrate all their actions to me as the personal God or as the divine incarnation, who regard me as the supreme goal, who worship me and meditate upon me with single-minded concentration, for those whose minds are thus absorbed in me, I become ere long the saviour from the world's ocean of mortality. And I believe all of those quotes were from the Bhagavad Gita. Back to Huxley. These three ways of deliverance are precisely correlated with the three categories, in terms of which Sheldon has worked out what is, without question, the best and most adequate classification of human differences. Human beings, he has shown, vary continuously between the viable extremes of a tripolar system, and physical and psychological measurements can be devised whereby any given individual may be accurately located in relation to the three coordinates. Or we can put the matter differently and say that any given individual is a mixture in varying proportions of three physical and three closely related psychological components. And as he's just quoted the Bhagavad Gita, that one of the chapters that we just read was the three modes of material nature: goodness, ignorance, and what's the other one? Tamas, Rajas, and Sattva. Knowledge, ignorance, and oh dear, I can't remember the other one, which isn't good. Something in the middle, obviously. The strength of each component can be measured according to empirically determined procedures. To the three physical components, Sheldon gives the names of endomorphy, mesomorphy, and ectomorphy. The individual with a high degree of endomorphy is predominantly soft and rounded, and may easily become grossly fat. The high mesomorph is hard, big-boned, and strong-muscled. The high ectomorph is slender and has small bones and stringy, weak, unemphatic muscles. The endomorph has a huge gut, a gut that may be more than twice as heavy and long, and twice as long as that of the extreme ectomorph. In a real sense, his or her body is built around the digestive tract. The centrally significant fact of the mesomorphic physique, on the other hand, is the powerful musculature, while that of the ectomorph is the oversensitive and, since the ratio of body surface to mass is higher in ectomorphs than in either of the other types, relatively unprotected nervous system. With endomorphic constitution is closely correlated a temperamental pattern, which Sheldon calls viscerotonia. Significant among the viscerotonic traits are love of food and, characteristically, love of eating in common, love of comfort and luxury, love of ceremoniousness, indiscriminate amiability and love of people as such, fear of solitude and craving for company, uninhibited expression of emotion, love of childhood in the form of nostalgia towards one's own past and in an intense enjoyment of family life, craving for affection and social support, a need of people when in trouble. The temperament that is related to mesomorphy is called somatonia. In this, the dominating traits are love of muscular activity, aggressiveness and lust for power, indifference to pain, callousness in regard to other people's feelings, a love of combat and competitiveness, a high degree of physical courage, a nostalgic feeling not for childhood but for youth, the period of maximum muscular power, a need for activity when in trouble. From the foregoing description, it will be seen how inadequate is the Jungian conception of extroversion as a simple antithesis to introversion. Extroversion is not simple, it is of two radically different kinds. There is the emotional, sociable extroversion of the viscerotonic endomorph, the person who is always seeking company and telling everybody just what he feels, and there is the extroversion of the big-muscled somatonic, the person who looks outward on the world as a place where he can exercise power, where he can bend people to his will and shape things to his heart's desire. One is the genial extroversion of the salesman, the Rotarian good mixer, the liberal Protestant clergyman. The other is the extroversion of the engineer, who works off his lust for power on things, of the sportsman and the professional blood and iron soldier, of the ambition business executive and politician, of the dictator, whether in the home or at the head of state. Yeah, I'm sure there's some influences of Rudolf Steiner in there as well, Laura, I'm sure of it. With cerebrotonia, the temperament that is correlated with ectomorphic physique, we leave the genial world of Pickwick, the strenuously competitive world of Hotspur, and pass into an entirely different and somewhat disquieting kind of universe, that of Hamlet and Ivan Karamazov. The extreme cerebrotonic is the over-alert, over-sensitive introvert, who is more concerned with what goes on behind his eyes, with the constructions of thought and imagination, with the variations of feeling and consciousness, than with that external world to which, in their different ways, the viscerotonic and the somatotonic pay their primary attention and allegiance. Cerebrotonics have little or no desire to dominate, nor do they feel the viscerotonic's indiscriminate liking for people as people. On the contrary, they want to live and let live, and their passion for privacy is intense. Solitary confinement, the most terrible punishment that could be inflicted on the soft, round, genial person, is, for the cerebrotonic, no punishment at all. For him, the ultimate horror is the boarding school and the barracks. In company, cerebrotonics are nervous and shy, tensely inhibited and unpredictably moody. It is a significant fact that no extreme cerebrotonic has ever been a good actor or actress. Cerebrotonics hate to slam doors or raise their voices, and suffer acutely from the unrestrained bellowing and trampling of the somatotonic. Their manner is restrained, and when it comes to expressing their feelings, they are extremely reserved. The emotional gush of the viscerotonic strikes them as offensively shallow and even insincere, nor have they any patience with viscerotonic ceremoniousness and love of luxury and magnificence. They do not easily form habits and find it hard to adapt their lives to the routines which come so naturally to somatotonics. Owing to their oversensitiveness, cerebrotonics are often extremely, almost insanely sexual, but they are hardly ever tempted to take drink, for alcohol, which heightens the natural aggressiveness of the somatotonic and increases the relaxed amiability of the viscerotonic, merely makes them feel ill and depressed. Each in his own way, the viscerotonic and the somatotonic are well adapted to the world they live in, but the introverted cerebrotonic is in some sort incommensurable with the things and people and institutions that surround him. Consequently, a remarkably high proportion of extreme cerebrotonics fail to make good as normal citizens and average pillars of society. But if many fail, many also become abnormal on the higher side of the average. In universities, monasteries, and research laboratories, wherever sheltered conditions are provided for those whose small guts and feeble muscles do not permit them to eat or fight their way through the ordinary rough and tumble, the percentage of outstandingly gifted and accomplished cerebrotonics will almost always be very high. Realizing the importance of this extreme, over-evolved and scarcely viable type of human being, all civilizations have provided in one way or another for its protection. So yeah, that's very interesting stuff. In the light of these descriptions, we can understand more clearly the Bhagavad Gita's classifications of paths of salvation. The path of devotion is the path naturally followed by the person in whom the viscerotonic component is high. His inborn tendency to externalize the emotions he spontaneously feels in regard to persons can be disciplined and canalized so that a merely animal gregariousness and a merely human kindliness become transformed into charity, devotion, the personal God and universal God, will and compassion towards all sentient beings. The path of works is for those whose extraversion is of the somatotonic kind, those who in all circumstances feel the need to do something. In the unregenerate somatotonic, this craving for action is always associated with aggressiveness, self-assertion and the lust for power. For the born Kshatriya or warrior ruler, the task, as Krishna explains to Arjuna, is to get rid of those fatal accompaniments to the love of action and to work without regard to the fruits of work, in a state of complete non-attachment to self, which is, of course, like everything else, a good deal easier said than done. Finally, there is the way of knowledge, through the modification of consciousness until it ceases to be ego-centered and becomes centered in and united with the divine ground. This is the way, I think that's quite a good way to summarize the spiritual way of knowledge. Through the modification of consciousness until it ceases to be ego-centered and becomes centered in and united with the divine ground. So you stop worrying about I, me and mine, and you worry more about the whole creation, matter, and all the other sentient beings above yourself, you know. This is the way to which the extreme cerebrotonic is naturally drawn. His special discipline consists in the mortification of his innate tendency towards introversion for its own sake, towards thought and imagination and self-analysis as ends in themselves rather than as means towards the ultimate transcendence of fantasy and discursive reasoning in the timeless act of pure intellectual intuition. Within the general population, as we have seen, variation is continuous, and in most people the three components are fairly evenly mixed. Those exhibiting extreme predominance of any one component are relatively rare, and yet, in spite of their rarity, it is by the thought patterns characteristic of these extreme individuals that theology and ethics, at any rate on the theoretical side, have been mainly dominated. The reason for this is simple. Any extreme position is more uncompromisingly clear and therefore more easily recognized and understood than the intermediate positions, which are the natural thought pattern of the person in whom the constituent components of personality are evenly balanced. These intermediate positions, it should be noted, do not in any sense contain or reconcile the extreme positions. They are merely other thought patterns added to the list of possible systems. The construction of an all-embracing system of metaphysics, ethics, and psychology is a task that can never be accomplished by any single individual for the sufficient reason that he is an individual with one particular kind of constitution and temperament, and therefore capable of knowing only according to the mode of his own being. Hence the advantages inherent in what may be called the anthological approach to truth. Yeah, mortification, I don't think it's yeah. The Sanskrit Dharma, one of the key words in Indian formulations of the perennial philosophy, has two principal meanings. The Dharma of an individual is, first of all, his essential nature, the intrinsic law of his being and development. But Dharma also signifies the law of righteousness and piety. The implications of this double meaning are clear. A man's duty, how he ought to live, what he ought to believe, and what he ought to do about his beliefs. These things are conditioned by his essential nature, his constitution and temperament. Going a good deal further than do the Catholics with their doctrine of vocations, the Indians admit the right of individuals with different dharmas to worship different aspects or conceptions of the divine. Hence the almost total absence among Hindus and Buddhists of bloody persecutions, religious wars, and proselytizing imperialism. It should, however, be remarked that, within its own ecclesiastical fold, Catholicism has been almost as tolerant as Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism. Nominally one, each of these religions consists, in fact, of a number of very different religions, covering the whole gamut of thought and behavior, from fetishism through polytheism, through legalistic monotheism, through devotion to the sacred humanity of the avatar, to the profession of the perennial philosophy, and the practice of a purely spiritual religion that seeks the unitive knowledge of the absolute Godhead. These tolerated religions within a religion are not, of course, regarded as equally valuable or equally true. To worship polytheistically may be one's dharma. Nevertheless, the fact remains that man's final end is the unitive knowledge of the Godhead, and all the historical formulations of the perennial philosophy are agreed that every human being ought, and perhaps in some way or other actually will, achieve that end. All souls, writes Father Garrigou Lagrange, all souls receive a general remote call to the mystical life, and if all were faithful in avoiding as they should not merely mortal but venial sin, if they were, each according to his condition, docile to the Holy Ghost, and if they lived long enough, a day would come when they would receive the proximate and efficacious vocation to a high perfection in the mystical life, properly so called. With this statement, Hindu and Buddhist theologians would probably agree, but they would add that every soul will in fact eventually attain this high perfection. All are called, but in any given generation few are chosen, because few choose themselves. But the series of conscious existences, corporeal or incorporeal, is indefinitely long. There is therefore time and opportunity for everyone to learn the necessary lessons. Moreover, there will always be helpers, for periodically there are descents of the Godhead into physical form, and at all times there are future Buddhas ready, on the threshold of reunion with the intelligible light, to announce the bliss of immediate liberation, in order to return as saviors and teachers again and again into the world of suffering and time and evil, until at last every sentient being shall have been delivered into eternity. So that paragraph there made me, hey King Arjun, good evening. That bit there made me think, like, if you have a tendency towards it, or we were talking yesterday about anyone having experienced, sort of some religious or spiritual spiritual occurrence in their life, and so if you have experienced that, go back and search for it. And some people, it comes on so intensely and so quickly that it scares them, and so they just leave it alone. But if you work slowly and with dedication and discipline towards these spiritual ends, like he says, realizing the divine ground and all these terms that he has for it, knowledge of the Godhead, etc., then I think you can get there. And if you're interested in that, and it brings peace, and it's much more interesting than what the world has to offer, then why wouldn't one take that up and follow it out? The practical consequences of this doctrine are clear enough. The lower forms of religion, whether emotional, active, or intellectual, are never to be accepted as final. True, each of them comes naturally to persons of a certain kind of constitution and temperament, but the dharma or duty of any given individual is not to remain complacently fixed in the imperfect religion that happens to suit him. It is rather to transcend it, not by impossibly denying the modes of thought, behavior, and feeling that are natural to him, but by making use of them, so that by means of nature he may pass beyond nature. Thus the introvert uses discrimination in the Indian phrase, and so learns to distinguish the mental activities of the ego from the principal consciousness of the self, which is akin to or identical with the divine ground. The emotional extrovert learns to hate his father and mother in order to give up his selfish attachment to the pleasures of indiscriminately loving and being loved, concentrates his devotion on the personal or incarnate aspect of God, and comes at last to love the absolute Godhead by an act no longer of feeling, but of will illuminated by knowledge. And finally, there is that other kind of extrovert, whose concern is not with the pleasures of giving or receiving affection, but with the satisfaction of his lust for power over things, events, and persons. Using his own nature to transcend his own nature, he must follow the path laid down in the Bhagavad Gita for the bewildered Arjuna, the path of work without attachments to the fruits of work, the path of what Saint Francois de Sales called holy indifference, the path that leads through the forgetting of self to the discovery of the self. In the course of history, it has often happened that one or other of the imperfect religions has been taken too seriously and regarded as good and true in itself, instead of as a means to the ultimate end of all religion. The effects of such mistakes are often disastrous. For example, many Protestant sects have insisted on the necessity, or at least the extreme desirability, of a violent conversion. But violent conversion, as Sheldon has pointed out, is a phenomenon confined almost exclusively to persons with a high degree of somatotonia. These persons are so intensely extroverted as to be quite unaware of what is happening in the lower levels of their minds. If for any reason their attention comes to be turned inwards, the resulting self-knowledge, because of its novelty and strangeness, presents itself with the force and quality of a revelation, and their metanoia of change of mind is sudden and thrilling. This change may be to religion, or it may be to something else, for example, to psychoanalysis. To insist upon the necessity of violent conversion as the only means to salvation is about as sensible as it would be to insist upon the necessity of having a large face, heavy bones, and powerful muscles. Yes, Laura, that's a beautiful quote. And did you ever read The Way of the Bodhisattva by Shantideva? It's like a scriptural text about the Bodhisattva. Is really beautiful. To those naturally subject to this kind of emotional upheaval, the doctrine that makes salvation dependent on conversion gives a complacency that is quite fatal to spiritual growth, while those who are incapable of it are filled with a no less fatal despair. Other examples of inadequate theologies based upon psychological ignorance could easily be cited. One remembers, for instance, the sad case of Calvin, the cerebrotonic who took his own intellectual construction so seriously that he lost all sense of reality, both human and spiritual. And then there is our liberal Protestantism, that predominantly viscerotonic hearsay, which seems to have forgotten the very existence of the Father, Spirit, and Logos, and equates Christianity with an emotional attachment to Christ's humanity, or, to use the currently popular phrase, the personality of Jesus, worshipped idolatrously as though there were no other God. Even within all comprehensive Catholicism, we constantly hear complaints of the ignorant and self-centered directors who impose upon our souls under their charge a religious dharma, wholly unsuited to their nature, with results which writers such as St. John of the Cross describe as wholly pernicious. We see then that it is natural for us to think of God as possessed of the qualities which our temperament tends to make us perceive in him, but unless nature finds a way of transcending itself by means of itself, we are lost. In the last analysis, Philo is quite right in saying that those who do not conceive God purely and simply as the one injure not God, of course, but themselves, and along with themselves, their fellows. The way of knowledge comes most naturally to persons whose temperament is predominantly cerebrotonic. By this I do not mean that the following of this way is easy for the cerebrotonic. His specially besetting sins are just as difficult to overcome as are the sins which beset the power-loving somatotonic, and the extreme viscerotonic with his gluttony for food and comfort and social approval. Rather, I mean that the idea that such a way exists and can be followed, either by discrimination or through non-attached work and one-pointed devotion, is one which spontaneously occurs to the cerebrotonic. At all levels, the culture he is the natural monotheist, and this natural monotheist, as Dr. Radin's examples of primitive theology clearly show, is often a monotheist of the Tattvam Asi, inner light school. Persons committed by their temperament to one or other of the two kinds of extroversion are natural polytheists. But natural polytheists can without much difficulty be convinced of the theoretical superiority of monotheism. The nature of human reason is such that there is an intrinsic plausibility about any hypothesis which seeks to explain the manifold in terms of unity, to reduce apparent multiplicity to essential identity, and from this theoretical monotheism the half-converted polytheist can, if he chooses, go on through practices suitable to his own particular temperament, to the actual realization of the divine ground of his own and all other beings. So this is where in the Bhagavad Gita we learn about the Atman and the Paramatman. That sentence just says it lovely. To the actual realization of the divine ground of his own and all other beings. So by finding your own divine ground, you realize the divine ground within us all. He can, I repeat, and sometimes he actually does, but very often he does not. There are many theoretical monotheists whose whole life and every action prove that in reality they are still what their temperament inclines them to be, polytheists, worshippers not of the one God they sometimes talk about, but of the many gods, nationalistic and technological, financial and familial, to whom in practice they pay all their allegiance. And that sentence there, if you read Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, he talks about that, how humanity now worship is the nation, the technology, money, finance, and the family. So it's interesting, isn't it, that Huxley here sort of, I'm not finding my words very easy this evening. I can't find any of them. He's criticizing the monotheist. There it comes. He's criticizing the monotheist and saying, if you worship your nation and your family and your bank balance, then you're not a monotheist. You don't worship the one true God, the one, or the good, as Plato would call it. In Christian art, the Saviour has almost invariably been represented as slender, small bone, unemphatically muscled. Large, powerful Christs are a rather shocking exception to a very ancient rule. Of Rubens's Crucifixions, William Blake contemptuously wrote, "I understand Christ was a carpenter, and not a brewer's servant, my good sir." In a word, the traditional Jesus is thought of as a man of predominantly ectomorphic physique and therefore, by implication, of predominantly cerebrotonic temperament. The central core of primitive Christian doctrine confirms the essential correctness of the iconographic tradition. The religion of the Gospels is what we should expect from a cerebrotonic, not of course from any cerebrotonic, but from one who had used the psychophysical peculiarities of his own nature to transcend nature, who had followed his particular dharma to its spiritual goal. The insistence that the kingdom of heaven is within, the ignoring of ritual, the slightly contemptuous attitude towards legalism, towards the ceremonial routines of organized religion, towards hallowed days and places, the general otherworldliness, the emphasis laid upon restraint, not merely of overt action, but even of desire and unexpressed intention, the indifference to the splendors of material civilization and the love of poverty as one of the greatest of goods, the doctrine that non-attachment must be carried even into the sphere of family relationships, and that even devotion to the highest goals of merely human ideals, even the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, may be idolatrous distractions from the love of God. All these are characteristically cerebrotonic ideas, such as would never have occurred spontaneously to the extroverted power lover or the equally extroverted viscerotonic. Primitive Buddhism is no less predominantly cerebrotonic than primitive Christianity, and so is Vedanta, the metaphysical discipline which lies at the heart of Hinduism. Confucianism, on the contrary, is a mainly viscerotonic system, familial, ceremonious, and thoroughly this-worldly. And in Mohammedanism, we find a system which incorporates strongly somatotonic elements. Hence Islam's black record of holy wars and persecutions, a record comparable to that of later Christianity, after that religion had so far compromised with unregenerate somatotonia as to call its ecclesiastical organization the Church Militant. So far as the achievement of man's final end is concerned, it is as much of a handicap to be an extreme cerebrotonic or an extreme viscerotonic as it is to be an extreme somatotonic. But whereas the cerebrotonic and the viscerotonic cannot do much harm except to themselves and those in immediate contact with them, the extreme somatotonic, with his native aggressiveness, plays havoc with whole societies. From one point of view, civilization may be defined as a complex of religious, legal, and educational devices for preventing extreme somatotonics from doing too much mischief and for directing their irrepressible energies into socially desirable channels. Confucianism and Chinese culture have sought to achieve this end by inculcating filial piety, good manners, and an amiably viscerotonic Epicureanism, the whole reinforced somewhat incongruously by the cerebrotonic spirituality and restraints of Buddhism and classical Taoism. In India, the caste system represents an attempt to subordinate military, political, and financial power to spiritual authority, and the education given to all classes still insists so strongly upon the fact that man's final end is unitive knowledge of God, that even at the present time, even after nearly 200 years of gradually accelerating Europeanization, successful somatotonics will, in middle life, give up wealth, position, and power to end their days as humble seekers after enlightenment. Hello, Joanne. Peter Lee. Hello, everyone. Yes, Joanne, thank you. I've been trying my best to have a spiritual day and stay positive and optimistic and upbeat. We're nearly finished now, Brother Lee, but it's a very interesting chapter on the different temperaments of spiritual people, the different levels of being. So, very interesting. In Catholic Europe, as in India, there was an effort to subordinate temporal power to spiritual authority. But since the Church itself exercised temporal power through the agency of political prelates and mitrid businessmen, the effort was never more than partially successful. After the Reformation, even the pious wish to limit temporal power by means of spiritual authority was completely abandoned. Henry VIII made himself, in Stubbs's words, the Pope, the whole Pope, and something more than the Pope. And his example has been followed by most heads of state ever since. Power has been limited only by other powers, not by an appeal to first principles as interpreted by those who are morally and spiritually qualified to know what they are talking about. Meanwhile, the interest in religion has everywhere declined, and even among believing Christians the perennial philosophy has been to a great extent replaced by a metaphysic of inevitable progress and an evolving God, by a passionate concern not with eternity but with future time. And almost suddenly, within the last quarter of a century, there has been consummated what Sheldon calls a somatotonic revolution, directed against all that is characteristically cerebrotonic in the theory and practice of traditional Christian culture. Here are a few symptoms of this somatotonic revolution. In traditional Christianity, as in all the great religious formulations of the perennial philosophy, it was axiomatic that contemplation is the end and purpose of action. Today, the great majority even of professed Christians regard action directed towards material and social progress as the end, and analytic thought, there is no question any longer of integral thought or contemplation, as the means to that end. In traditional Christianity, as in the other formulations of the perennial philosophy, the secret of happiness and the way to salvation were to be sought, not in the external environment, but in the individual state of mind, with regard to the environment. Today, the all-important thing is not the state of the mind, but the state of the environment. Happiness and moral progress depend, it is thought, on bigger and better gadgets and a higher standard of living. I think Paramount's the most important. Peter Lee's asked an interesting question. Maybe we should address that. We're coming to the end of the chapter, so let's talk about Peter Lee's Paramount. Peter Lee says, at what point is the personality not paramount, the most important, or is the personality always there when interacting with the world? It's an interesting question, isn't it? But he says Aldous Huxley uses the term selflessness. So like denial of self or complete I was saying earlier, my words aren't coming, can't find my words. Complete transcendence of self. So I think like the great beings that we read about in all of these spiritual texts have sort of overcome the self. So I don't know, to talk about some of the things that Huxley has said, it's sort of God communicating with God, because he said here it's a hard question, Joanne, don't worry about that. Here he says let me see if I can find the bit. I reread it because it was an interesting thing. Just to see if we can address I think it's further back. It's not very good. Not very good viewing. Sorry, guys, but it's there was a great quote about the divine reality. But I'm not going to be able to find it, am I? Oh, here we go. There's a bit before, I may as well read the whole sentence. And so learns to distinguish the mental activities of the ego from the principal consciousness of the self, which is akin to or identical with the divine ground. Now that's not what I was looking for. But he speaks about by coming to understand the divine ground in ourselves, we understand it in everyone. So I think I'm going to say that one can overcome or transcend the personality when interacting with the world. And then there's no small s self, only the capital S self relating with the world. Thanks for your question, Peter Lee. We're going around the houses. Let me where were we? In traditional Christian education, the stress was all on restraint. With the recent rise of the progressive school, it is all on activity and self-expression. Traditionally, Christian good manners outlawed all expressions of pleasure in the satisfaction of physical appetites. You may love a screeching owl, but you must not love a roasted fowl. It's an interesting quote. You may love a screeching owl, but you must not love a roasted fowl. Such was the rhyme on which children were brought up in the nurseries of only 50 years ago. Today the young unceasingly proclaim how much they love and adore different kinds of food and drink. Adolescents and adults talk about the thrills they derive from the stimulation of their sexuality. The popular philosophy of life has ceased to be based on the classics of devotion and the rules of aristocratic good breeding, and is now moulded by the writers of advertising, blimey, advertising. Going round, yeah, Joanne, it's going round the houses. It's I don't know where the saying comes from, but it's an English saying, I think. Using a lot of words or taking a long time to say something. Like if you say, "Oh, where have you been?" you could just say, "I've been here," or you could go around the houses and say, "Well," and talk, and only at the end of all the talking, say, "I've been at the park." So you went round the houses in order to say it. The popular philosophy of life has ceased to be based on the classics of devotion and the rules of aristocratic good breeding, and is now moulded by the writers of advertising copy whose one idea is to persuade everybody to be as extroverted and uninhibitedly greedy as possible, since, of course, it is only the possessive, the restless, the distracted who spend money on the things that advertisers want to sell. Peter Lee's made another 1945, I think, Laura, the Perennial Philosophy originally. 44, 45. I'm going to finish the chapter and then we can come back to Peter Lee's other query or question or statement, it looks like. We'll get to that in a second, and I think Peter might have to help us. Technological progress is in part the product of the somatotonic revolution, in part the producer and sustainer of that revolution. The extroverted attention results in technological discoveries. Significantly enough, a high degree of material civilization has always been associated with the large-scale and officially sanctioned practice of polytheism. In their turn, technological discoveries have resulted in mass production, and mass production, it is obvious, cannot be kept going at full blast except by persuading the whole population to accept the somatotonic Weltanschauung and act accordingly. So yeah, it's so fascinating, Laura. That he's talking about advertising, technology, materialism in 1945. So in 1945 it was a problem and Aldous Huxley could see it, and now, it's how much more of a problem is it today? Like technological progress, with which it is so closely associated in so many ways, modern war is at once a cause and a result of the somatotonic revolution. Nazi education, which was specifically education for war, had two principal aims: to encourage the manifestation of somatotonia in those most richly endowed with that component of personality, and to make the rest of the population feel ashamed of its relaxed amiability or its inward-looking sensitiveness and tendency towards self-restraint and tender-mindedness. During the war, the enemies of Nazism have been compelled, of course, to borrow from the Nazis' educational philosophy. All over the world, millions of young men and even of young women are being systematically educated to be tough and to value toughness beyond every other moral quality. With this system of somatotonic ethics is associated the idolatrous and polytheistic theology of nationalism, a pseudo-religion far stronger at the present time for evil and division than is Christianity or any other monotheistic religion for unification and good. In the past, most societies tried systematically to discourage somatotonia. This was a measure of self-defense. They did not want to be physically destroyed by the power-loving aggressiveness of their most active minority, and they did not want to be spiritually blinded by an excess of extroversion. During the last few years, all this has been changed. What, we may apprehensively wonder, will be the result of the current worldwide reversal of an immemorial social policy? Time alone will show. So it's very interesting. Time alone will show, so we can all look at the world how we see it today, and Aldous Huxley is seeing a lot of these problems in 1945, and so it's interesting to see where we've come today. Chapter 9 is about self-knowledge, so that proves to be a very interesting chapter. Self-knowledge, about the self or the personality. Plato or the oracle at Delphi would say, know thyself, and that was a big part of Plato's work, and that's a very short one actually, so that's so short I think I'll be able to do that on Thursday evening, a bit easier, or sorry, a bit later than normal. I have another Zoom call to do, and then I don't know if you guys saw, I'm going to be reading, it's looking like Black Beauty that I'll be reading on Sunday evening for a change, a break away from the Perennial Philosophy. Let me tell you guys, because I think it's winning by a long way. Yes, Black Beauty Anna Sewell is looking like winning. So let me go back to Peter Lee's. The chat's been going Peter Lee. That does the personality lessen as the self is overcome, or is the selfish ego gone, but there is still a recognizable character even then? Maybe an expression of the neurological mind-brain. Again, I think let's is the self is overcome, or the selfish ego? Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? There must be something still remaining, because you still have your name, right? People get initiated and have new names, but to other people they still remain the same name. So maybe the name has something to do with it, the character. What Plotinus would say in his Enneads, wouldn't he, that the soul and the body combine to create the personality, the couplement, the character. And so if we look into Plotinus's Neoplatonism, he definitely says that there is such a thing as a character, a personality, a couplement. So does that disappear? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just more connected, or associates itself more with the divine and with the soul and the spirit than it does with the body and with matter. And yeah, I mean, that's probably what Plotinus would say somewhere. And then in the Bhagavad Gita philosophy, you would say that, well, they would say that the soul is Krishna, right? The Atman and the Paramatman are one, and the Atman is one and the same with Brahman. And Aldous Huxley has said as much in some of the previous chapters of the Perennial Philosophy, that the soul is one with the universe and creator. And the bit I was trying to find, I'll try and paraphrase it, but he was saying that by coming to the divine ground in ourselves, we come to the divine ground of everyone. And so for me, what Huxley's saying there is that if you come to your own divine ground, then you've experienced the divine ground within each and every one of us. So, yeah, thanks for your questions, Peter Lee. They're very, cause us to think deeply about the question. I'm just looking through if there's anything else. Peter and Laura are talking. Laura says, Peter, I think for most people, something of the ego stays to interact with people. I've read many theories, though. And yes, of course, if you become an enlightened being, but you still have to head down to Tesco's, to the shops to get your bread and milk, you still have to, excuse me, how you doing? You still have to talk and interact with people. So, yes. And Peter Lee says to Laura, I think the first two, Laura, many masters seem to still have big personalities without a reference point of selfishness. Yes, sorry, Joanne. Hunger Games will be coming. Hunger Games will be coming soon, I think, Joanne. I really want to read that, so I'll be reading that soon. Laura says she's read about the masters who drink all the time and how can the two coexist. And I suppose the master would argue that they're above, they've transcended sobriety and drunkenness. It doesn't matter to them. That's what I've read anyway. Laura says, too bad none of us know firsthand what it's like. Well, God willing, inshallah, there's still time for us to find out. So it's just about dedication and time and work and doing the right practices. And Peter Lee, it might be that the mind can continue its running in the hamster wheel, but the higher awareness does not identify with it. And yet, I'll read that again because that's very nicely put. It might be that the mind can continue its running in the hamster wheel, but the higher awareness does not identify with it. So we read about, even in the Perennial Philosophy, about non-attachment. And just in that chapter we just read, he quotes the Bhagavad Gita about working without care for the results of your action. So yes, that's sort of what Peter Lee's saying there, that you're still doing your work, but you're not attached to what happens about the outcome of your work, or in anything, I suppose, in life. In Bhagavad Gita, they'd say Bhakti Yoga, devotional service. I think it's different to what I'm just describing, but if you do everything for Krishna, then you don't have any interest in the results of your action, because you give it all up to God and let him take care. So okay, so unless anyone has anything else to share or input or ask, I think that'll be it for this evening. Like I say, I think Thursday night, the next chapter, self-knowledge, is very short. So Thursday evening, I'll be doing that a bit later. And Sunday, unless something changes drastically with the poll, we'll be having Black Beauty. And then sadly, Joanne, Treasure Island has taken over the Hunger Games, but I think I'll read them all in time because they're all amazing. So Sundays will be for these books, one of those four. And then we'll do the Perennial Philosophy during the week. Sundays will be for the big books. You're very welcome. And Laura says, I have a hard time straddling the line between not caring and non-attachment. And I think that's a very difficult thing. it's a very fine knife edge, isn't it? Not caring and not attached is very difficult, which I don't think we can get into this evening, Laura, because that's yeah, that's a bit too much for this evening's discussion. But it can be very very difficult, the two things. So, and to conclude the reading, Peter Lee says the state of being slightly drunk can emphasize that mental processes can be impaired, but primal awareness is pristine. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You can be drunk and the mental processes stop working. I've had much experience in this, so I'm somewhat of an expert. But the awareness is still there, even behind the drunkenness. So yes, well put, Peter Lee. And everyone, thanks for being here and being so active in the chat. I do love to see you guys yeah, having great conversations and communications while I'm reading along. So thanks everyone for being here and being so chatty, and fellowship, some lovely fellowship in the chat. But for now, guys, I think Thursday night, a bit later, it'll be a very short chapter, but if you can come, I think it'll be about 9:30, between 9:30 and 10, very short, but hopefully we can have some more great conversation. But for now, guys, take care, good night, and I'll see you Thursday evening, a bit later than normal, between 9:30 and 10. All right, guys, take care. I'll see you soon.